Hello everyone, my name is Chloe and my pronouns are Cleanty. I am NEADS Educational Programming Director. Thank you for sharing this space with us. I am a white queer settler. This ultimately signifies that I benefit from resource and resources generated and disseminated by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit business, indigenous, disabled business, as well as considerate peoples. I'm currently reside on the traditional territory of the Ottawa and Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenni-Black peoples. Though the territory of the Algonquin peoples will forever be my home and where I first learned from indigenous communities. As our community-based researcher and a doctoral student, I am continuously learning about the intersections that exist between disability and indigeneity, and ultimately how society further marginalizes these communities. Through my work, I commit myself to unlearn knowledge embedded in colonialism and recognize the systems of oppression that remain at the forefront of education. I strive to improve my own learnings of the world that I greatly benefit from.
The National Educational Association of Disabled Students NEADS is a far and for post-disability, post-Canada charitable organization supporting full access to education and employment for disabled post-secondary students and graduates. NEADS works across three statistic areas of depth reduction, experience in class, and on campus and employment. By doing so, we offer a variety of events, resources, reports, financial assistance programs, and an opportunity for disabled students and graduates. We collab with post-secondary stakeholders, other non-governmental organizations, employees, disabled student providers, and community members to provide opportunities in higher education in the labor market for disabled students. We also provide ongoing advice for Employment and Social Development Canada and provincial and territorial governments and work to promote government programs and services that support higher education for disabled students. Now, The Virtual Access for All program is a two-year project with an additional 2-year expansion, funded by Employment and Social Development of Canada. Supports for students learning program. The program aims to empower and support disabled students, whether they go through the many obstacles of post-secondary education. NEADS recognizes the layers of ableism prevailing with these institutions. Our team thus strives to offer programming in which mutual care and collaboration at the forefront. This provides space for discussion and resource sharing. Such examples of programming include, but not are limited to, the following: monthly webinars, disabled activists and students, community members, collaborations and partners, hybrid tour stops at post-secondary campuses throughout Canada, as well as a quarterly report highlighting the challenges and successes of post-secondary institutions, though disability and intersectionality lenses. Lastly, this project allows for expansion of our financial assistance program and funded our accessibility resilience program.
Thank you. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome today's guest presenter, Dr. Kathleen Clarke is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Wilfrid Laurier University, where she teaches in the student affairs field of study of the Master of Education program. Her research explores the experiences of underrepresented and marginalized student groups, such as disabled students, and how they can be further supported within post-secondary institutions. Today, Dr. Clarke joins us to discuss a research project entitled COVID-19 Impacts of the Pandemic on the Educational Experiences of Graduate Students with Disabilities in Canada. She will provide an overview of what prompted the study and how it unfolded. Describe key findings and their implications, as well as discuss future action items. Welcome, Dr. Clarke.
Great. Thank you so much, Chloe, for the warm welcome. I am going to share my slides that I prepared for today. Just give me 1 second. Can you see my slides? Chloe?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Kyla. Okay, thank you everyone for joining this afternoon to hear about the research project that I undertook alongside NEADS. Today, as Chloe mentioned, I'll talk about the impact of the pandemic on disabled graduate students. I started this work with NEADS during the pandemic. And as Chloe mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Wilfrid Laurier University. I want to start by offering a land acknowledgement. This specifically is Laurier's land acknowledgement, which says we would like to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldeman Tract, traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. From the Haldeman Treaty of October 25th, 1784, this territory is described as 6 miles deep from each side of the river. And when they say river, it's referring to the Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in the proportion to the head of said river. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from across Turtle Island. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and water on which Laurier is now present. On this slide has the land acknowledgement and then an image that shows kind of the GTA area and the Haldeman Tract in green. And then there is a very small portion near Brantford in orange that represents the Six Nations Reserve. So the Haldeman Tract was the land that was promised, and then currently this is how much land is theirs. One of the ways that I try to think beyond the land acknowledgement is think about connections to the topics that I'm looking at. So in this case, it's related to disability and graduate education. And really, I think about what does disability mean to different groups of people? So what does disability mean to different Indigenous peoples? How does that intersect? How does disability intersect with their experience of indigeneity? And how does that connect to graduate education? Considering questions like these are one way that I try to recognize, honor, and respect the experiences and perspectives of Indigenous peoples. On the slide is a statement that says each tribe and individual tribe member may construct disability and what it means to have a disability differently than others. So the questions I just mentioned might prompt you to think about what exactly disability means. What language do people use when referring to graduate students with disabilities? I'm thinking around institutions and whether they're using students with disabilities or graduate students with disabilities or disabled graduate students. All of us connect to the construct of disability in different ways and have different experiences. For graduate students with disabilities in particular, identity around disability can change in different ways and can be experienced in different ways throughout their program. So I'll talk about some of those different ways today that will really highlight how graduate students and their experience is going to look very different than the undergraduate experience. Just a quick agenda for today. I'll briefly kind of mention who was on the research team, I'll kind of mention who we're talking about when we say disabled graduate students. I'll identify what's different about graduate students and why disabled graduate students might need tailored support that differs from the undergraduate level. Briefly talk about the context and then provide an overview of some key pieces from the study and say what the next steps are related to this work. So it's first important to acknowledge that this was a SSHRC-funded study that took place in collaboration between myself and NEADS. Without NEADS and folks like Frank Smith, Chloe, and Chelsea, this work wouldn't have been possible. And I also want to acknowledge the research assistants at Laurier who helped support this work. I also want to acknowledge the work that others who are part of the disabled community were able to offer this project. And one of the ways that I think this project pushed me is by thinking about how to do research with disabled populations and with disabled folks instead of on disabled people. And thinking about that throughout the research process. So everything from conceptualizing the project right through to the end of the project. And I think that's a really important part for students and even those involved in NEADS to think about is how are researchers engaging with disabled community in ways that are authentic. So just to kind of highlight some of the key pieces from the literature around graduate students. So the graduate context can look a lot different than the undergraduate context, and graduate students, especially disabled graduate students, are often overlooked in the literature in favor of undergraduate students. So these are some of the things that are kind of capturing the complexity of graduate education. There's often fewer benchmarks, especially during the thesis and writing stages. They have additional responsibilities like different kinds of employment, TA and RA work. There might be off-campus employment and family responsibilities. There's increased involvement in production of knowledge that might not necessarily be a focus at the undergraduate level. And as many participants talked about in my study, was the increased isolation that is experienced at the graduate level. So who are we talking about when we say disabled graduate students? The point I want to make with this slide is really that graduate students are often kind of grouped all together, and institutions and different services on campus don't really consider the specific subgroups of students that are under that. And this happens a lot with disabled graduate students as well. Everyone is kind of lumped together and they're not looking at kind of the unique needs of subgroups that are part of this kind of umbrella group. So things that you might want to think about if you're going to graduate school are, different needs around your master's level versus a PhD level or other doctorate. Those can look very different, whether you're at the coursework stage, comprehensive exam, thesis, or placement. What you experience at those different stages can be very different. And I think that highlights kind of the unique graduate focus and why institutions need to think about these subgroups of where students are in their programs. Discipline is another aspect that needs to be considered. Different kinds of challenges and accommodations are needed depending on discipline. Accommodations in the sciences might look very different than in the social sciences. So that's something that needs to be considered, different types of disabilities and what those different accommodations are, and number of disabilities. So these are all just demonstrating the complexity of what can be kind of underneath that heading of disabled graduate students. So disability in graduate education, this slide kind of highlights some key media headings demonstrating that this is kind of a topic that a lot of people have been talking about for a long time. And some of these headlines are capturing key themes that we're talking about in the research we're engaging in and that students are talking about. So accommodations at the graduate level, disclosing your disability in graduate school, that's a big topic that I talk about with students. When to disclose their disability, when they choose to, how they choose to do that, navigating the hidden curriculum as a graduate student with a disability. So outside of coursework in your thesis, there are a lot of other things that you might want to do or have to do. that are known as the hidden curriculum. What does it look like for disabled graduate students to engage in those things, like conferences, publishing? Are those different things accessible? What do accommodations look like in those types of activities? So to give you some background about the Canadian context, one of the first reports I could find that relate to disabled graduate students was written by Marilyn Rose in 2010. In this document, there are a series of recommendations, and it's kind of interesting to revisit this report 15 years later and see that a lot of the recommendations are still things that we advocate for today. So tailored supports, more accommodations that meet the needs of disabled graduate students, information about how to navigate that accommodation process, what the accommodations might look like, educating faculty members on how to support disabled graduate students. And on this slide is a bar chart that demonstrates that the population of, for this survey, the population of graduate students with disabilities is really increasing. So this is from the Canadian Graduate and Professional Student Survey that's done every 3 years. And the bars capture 2016, 2019, 2022, and then the data are being collected again in 2025. But we do see a drastic increase in 2022, which could be because of the pandemic and more students needing accommodations in that kind of different time. Or it could be other factors. So it could be just more students identifying as having a disability to get access to accommodations. There's a lot of different factors that can come into that. So I wanted to really highlight first the important work that NEADS has done around graduate students with disabilities. In 2015, there was a national task force on the experiences of graduate students with disabilities. There was a survey that was done across Canada, focus groups, interviews with key people that were knowledgeable in this area. And there were a number of recommendations that were made from that project. And here are some of the findings. So access offices don't know how undergraduate and graduate student accommodation needs differ. And even 10 years later, this is something that we still talk about. How do those needs differ? How are institutions supporting disabled graduate students with accommodations in things like a thesis or a field placement, field work, where they're conducting research in different kinds of areas? Access offices and faculty don't know how to accommodate graduate students with disabilities, different types of disabilities as well. Faculty are unaware of the impact often of disability and what they can do to support students, and then negative supervisor attitudes. So I kind of comparing these 2015 findings and recommendations to work from 2010, the same things are being discussed, and even 10 years later now, we're still talking about the same things. So the pandemic intensified a lot of the pre-existing barriers or issues that disabled graduate students experienced. Pre-pandemic challenges with supervisors was a key topic that researchers discussed, and we saw that that became even more challenging sometimes at times in the pandemic. And some of the reason for that is negotiating accommodations. So because of the different learning environment, this meant that sometimes new accommodations were necessary, or accommodations needed to change, and supervisors had to kind of navigate that, as well as accessibility offices. We then also see that there were research labs that were closed, which then impacted disabled graduate students. Teaching or research assistant positions that had different work environments that then required accommodations in those different contexts. increased financial challenges, taking on care responsibilities, and heightened stress and exacerbated mental health challenges. So that kind of prompted the study that we undertook. And what we did was we started with qualitative interviews at one institution. We ended up doing about 39 interviews, and we asked questions around identity. How do students make sense of their disability identity? How would that change since before the pandemic, if at all? What challenges were students experiencing during the pandemic that were worsened because of the pandemic context? What sources of support were they using now compared to pre-pandemic, and what kind of needs did students have? And then workplace. So I mentioned research assistant and teaching assistant roles. Those workplace roles saw different kinds of needs that were required. And then the second part was a survey. This was done across Canada. And just to give you a sense of the types of things we asked about, there was a demographic section, a section about disability support, disclosure, overall impact of the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic on academics, finances and employment, mental health and well-being, and then belonging, campus community. So I'm not going through all of this in the short time that we have, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what we kind of covered in the survey. And we kind of cast a broad net for both the interviews and the survey. We didn't narrow it down based on disability type or any other demographics because there was so little research that was being done about disabled graduate students. So I really wanted to cast a broad net and try and get a sense of the complexity of the different kinds of experiences during the pandemic. So briefly, as I mentioned, we did 39 interviews. Most of these were master's students, and a lot of them were course-based students. So I mentioned this because, as I said earlier, the experience of being a master's student who's course-based is going to be different than a master's student who is thesis-based. So that gives you this gives you a sense of who was in the sample. For PhD students, we had 11, and 3 were in courses, 1 comprehensive exam, and 7 thesis. So again, there were differences between the master's student experience and then the doctoral level as well. To give you a sense of the disciplines that students were located within, about half were in human and social sciences, education and social work. And then we saw 30% in arts or liberal arts and music. And then other areas we looked at were the sciences and business economics, international policy and governance. And so we did get a lot of participants that were in social sciences, education, and social work. So that's something that I would want to look at in future work is how do these experiences, not necessarily during the pandemic, but what do accommodations and what kinds of different challenges do students experience depending on those different disciplines? Number of disabilities, about half of participants reported more than one. I was not surprised to see that there was significant diversity in the type of disability. Half registered with accessible learning services. And we saw some slight differences with in terms of PhD students versus master's students and why students were not reporting, but accessing accommodations. The next slide is around identity, and what this slide shows is a wordle of different conditions that students identified as having. So in large letters, there are terms like ADHD, learning disability, anxiety, mental health disability, depression, chronic pain. And what we found in the interviews was that students were using a lot of different terms to describe their conditions, and there wasn't a lot of consistency. And I think that really demonstrates the identity part to disability and how students construct their own identity in relation to their experiences, and the need for institutions to really understand that the language that they're using may not necessarily align with the language that their students, their graduate students are using. Students' understanding of their conditions changes over time as well. So some students talked about how pre-pandemic they identified as having anxiety or depression, but they didn't necessarily see that as a disability. It wasn't until the pandemic where a lot of their challenges were worsened, and then they kind of requested accommodations to support them in their academics because of that different context. So that really demonstrates the shift in identity for that as well. And then lastly, participants, a lot of participants had multiple conditions, not always viewing their conditions as disabilities. So even when there are multiple disability identities or multiple conditions, not all of those were connected with disability. So that also captures the complexity of this. The other thing I wanted to highlight for the findings was some of the things we talked about in terms of support. So interview questions that we asked about on-campus support during the pandemic were, what kind of services or accommodations have you used during your current program? How have you navigated disclosure during your current program? And have you found that you have had to / wanted to disclose your disability or disabilities to peers, faculty? And then when we conducted these interviews, we talked about what are your experiences now and how is that experience different than pre-pandemic? So when we talk to students, we often heard about faculty and a lot, and how students were going to faculty members to really get individualized support depending on their coursework or their thesis, and negotiating accommodations kind of informally with instructors or thesis supervisors. Then the second part was the role of peers, and that's where I think NEADS is so important in organizing things like this webinar, where folks can connect with other students. On the slide is a quote that says, "I think that our cohort is very close and very open with one another. It feels very much like a learning community," which I really appreciate. They've been a great source of support for me. So students were talking about peers, but this was kind of, these relationships were fostered organically and not facilitated by the institution. So we have informal negotiation with faculty, and then also informal connections that were being developed by peers, not necessarily the role that the institutions were taking on. And then where the institution comes in, accommodations. Accessing accommodations seem to be highly valued by many of the participants, but also talking about how accommodation needs were really changing because of the online context of education, and a context that they had not previously been doing. Workplace related questions. Were students working during the pandemic? Did they have to decline any work opportunities? What disability related challenges did students who were working experience because of the pandemic? And were students accessing any accommodations related to the workplace? And this is kind of, I know NEADS has done some work related to the workplace, But for graduate students with disabilities, this can be a really difficult thing to navigate, where the employment options are often research assistant roles and teaching assistant roles. And depending on things like collective agreements and things like that, navigating an accommodation process for these employment opportunities can get really messy. And there's not always a clear pathway for how that is to be done. And what we heard was that a lot of the time, the accommodations were, again, informally negotiated with the instructor that was teaching the course. And there was a lot of difficulty navigating those conversations and trying to get work situations and accommodations that allowed these students to complete their work. So I just want to highlight that because of the pandemic, there were a lot of challenges that students experienced that were not just inside court. And all of this navigation of negotiating with faculty, negotiating with institutions, all of that requires extra steps and energy, right? So not only is it a pandemic, we then heard a lot about students having to do this extra work to get accommodations that they were entitled to. And then on the slide are just a few quotes. So professors don't know how to deal with it. I was made to feel like I was a problem. The reality is that if something takes somebody 1 hour to do, it'll take me 4 to 10 hours to do the same thing. One of my professors made a reference for me to work as a research assistant. And then in the end, this person had to say no because it would be too much work because of the accommodations that were not being granted to them. So given that research assistant roles and TA roles are important to the development of graduate students, this is a really important topic. And I'm kind of concerned that because of the limited opportunities and limited accommodations during the pandemic, that we're actually going to see long-term effects from that. So we see few disabled faculty members in academia, and because graduate students were limited often in what they were able to participate in, that is then going to set disabled scholars back even more. We heard also that participants often would not disclose because they didn't sometimes want to do that additional emotional labor of negotiation. And then there were a lot of students who felt that because of the online context, they didn't have to disclose. So it was kind of on an as-needed basis. Quickly, I'll go through some of the survey information. So the next couple slides have some graphics. The number of completed surveys we got was 94 from across Canada. Most of the students were in the 25 to 29-year-old age range, mostly female. Not surprising that the most frequent type of disability was mental health and learning disability. The next slide has two graphs that show which stage students were currently in. So most of the participants were in coursework, but there were a lot of options of where students could be, what students could be working on during their graduate degree, and students were kind of all over the place. And what this graph shows also is almost a third of the participants said other. So even though there was a long list of different things that people could be working on, this was not a long enough list. And there were other components of academic programs that were not captured, again, highlighting how complex graduate school can be. And then in terms of discipline, similar to the interviews, we had the most in social sciences and arts and humanities. Most students, actually, we saw about a third in course-based masters. It would have been nice to have gotten more PhD students, and most students were in the first or second year of their program. I know I'm running out of time, so I will quickly highlight some key things related to some of the topics. This slide asks, during your current program, in what ways did you disclose your disability to your institution? We had a long list of different places where students might disclose, and 65% disclosed to a professor, 54% disclosed to accessible learning. So similar to the interviews, we saw that that role of the professor or faculty member was really essential for supporting students and helping students navigate this pandemic environment. And then the next one was disclosed to accessible learning for formal accommodations. And then after that, we see disclosed on scholarship application, which kind of speaks to some of the financial considerations. Some of the accommodations that folks received at the beginning of the pandemic, assignment extensions was a big one, extra exam time. And then something that surprised us was a lot of students reported other. So again, we had a long list of different kinds of accommodations, and then other was still at 19%. So that kind of highlights how many different accommodations might be available at the graduate level, and how institutions need to really look at the range of accommodations and how they can be applied in the different stages of a graduate degree. We also saw that a large number of students, their willingness to disclose their disability changed during the pandemic. And for the most part, we saw that students had become more willing to disclose because accommodation needs were not being met. Impacts of the pandemic: inability to attend conferences, lack of study space, reduced ability to engage in class. The inability to attend conferences, with 38% of participants reporting that, connects to that TA and RA role that I mentioned previously. So if students are not able to take on RA positions or TA positions, and we're unable to attend conferences, those are all the things that support students when they're looking for different kinds of jobs post-graduation, right? So not being able to do these things, or having limited opportunities to do those things, can have long-term effects. And those are effects that we're likely still going to see now for a while. A lot of students said that they thought that their academic timelines or milestones were delayed because of the pandemic, which again speaks to that long-term effect. And students, a lot of them said that they felt the pandemic would impact future employment prospects. So because of those things I mentioned, like RATA, not able to engage in conferences, or inaccessible conferences, those types of things potentially have long-term effects. And then this slide mentions belonging, and it's a bar graph as well. And the data really showed us that students' sense of belonging was not there. So there was a lot of isolation during the pandemic. And then we're still hearing about that now. That sense of belonging is not there. And there hasn't been really that reconnection with institutions. this slide, it has a quote that I think captures a lot of the experiences of students that we talk to. It says, "Zero solidarity with disabled folks and a complete willingness to abandon our needs and move on to get back to normal, whatever the cost to disabled members of the community." So now that a lot of institutions have transitioned back to face-to-face, that again has created a context in which disabled graduate students have had to navigate that. And any improvements that were made in terms of access and accommodations during the pandemic sometimes have been removed and have created additional barriers. So that's kind of the type of thing that I'm seeing in my work now, is this institutional need to get back to normal, which really is not always supportive of what students are needing. Recommendations, flexible accommodation policies and procedures. There were accommodations that were done during the pandemic that are not being done anymore. So my recommendation is that those policies and procedures, some of those additional opportunities, training for faculty and access office staff. So in both the interviews and the survey, we heard about the important role of faculty and access offices. So there needs to be more training around that. Different areas across campus that disabled graduate students can go to feel a sense of belonging. Continue collecting data, because there are so few people that are doing this work. We in Canada do not have a good sense of this population. Service promotion and further consideration of the impact of the pandemic and how it might have impacted graduate students that are seeking employment today and in the coming years. And there are a few references, including the NEADS report about understanding accessibility in graduate education for students with disabilities in Canada. And here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clarke. This was very enlightening and the appropriate research process. We do have a few minutes remaining, so if you begin, there are a few questions in the chat.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, so for a question about categorizing ADHD, I'd have to go back to the slides, but we started by looking at identity and how really looking at the language that students were using. I think that we ended up putting it separate as neurological because that's the way that students were talking about it. But I have seen some literature that even includes mental health and ADHD together. So I think that that question highlights how important it is to talk to disabled community members to get feedback on how you might make those types of decisions. I can definitely share my slides with Chloe to share with folks that attended the webinar. Do you believe there is a causation between the lack of resources for people with disabilities and the lack of later term PhD students, maybe due to disengagement? Yes. So we know that about half of graduate students that start graduate programs, well, PhD programs, do not finish. And for graduate students with disabilities who often are facing additional challenges to navigate, that can make it even more challenging to stay engaged in their programs. And the research shows that the more engaged students are or integrated into their programs, the more likely they are going to continue in the program. And this is where that sense of belonging comes in. If students aren't feeling like they belong and they're isolated for years, then the chance that they are going to continue and finish in their degree is not as high. So I don't have statistics to say yes, but those are the kinds of things that students talk about in their interviews. Alice asked a question in the chat. When the response was other, did you ask the participant to specify? Yes. I don't always, because I don't always get a lot of respondents that say other, but in this study, I was shocked by how many students responded other on a variety of questions. So I did ask what students were putting under other and what we were not capturing. There's so much complexity to capture that it's difficult to put that into an hour. So yeah, as we continue to develop resources and publish some things from that, that is something that we'll definitely be including. Okay, last question. How does the proportion of grad students with disabilities from the last survey compared to that of undergrads? So yeah, we're seeing an increase at the data show, an increase at the grad level. There is an increase at the undergrad level, but there's not a lot of data that actually shows this. And there's probably more data and more accurate data at the undergrad level. So even the CGPSS data is not great in terms of looking at prevalence. And there was a slight change with that disability question on the CGPSS that may have contributed to that large increase. It's the CGPSS, and it's by the Canadian Association of Graduate Studies. I'll put my email in the chat if people want to reach out to me. Again, thank you to NEADS and Chloe for the invitation to share some of this work. And I'm looking forward to doing some additional work together. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you again, Dr. Clarke. Thank you to the ASL interpreters and to Kathleen and to my team for helping with today's event. And with that, we will close the webinar. Thank you, everyone.